how did you come to cease being a nun? What was there an inflection or a catalyst or what?
Well, I came back to the West, and I was the only Tibetan Buddhist nun in America, Western or Tibetan. At that time it was 1972, end of 1972. And so I went into Trungpa Rinpoche's Sangha in Vermont, and it was completely wild, and parties, a lot of drinking and all kinds of stuff going on, and I felt incredibly isolated and alone, and I wasn't actually that committed to the monastic path in any case. It was, as I told you the story of how it all happened, and so it was more like I was committed to the Dharma than that I was committed to being a nun per se. And I began to see that it would be possible to pursue this path seriously as a Western nun. I mean, I could pursue it not being a nun. And so that combined with my age, I think I didn't really want to be celibate, so I was 26. And I just didn't want to stand out. I remember going into St. Johnsbury, Vermont, into a barber shop and asking if they would shave my head. And everybody in the whole place stops talking and turns and looks. And, it was, people would ask me if I did brain surgery. And so it was much less sort of known and acceptable at that time. And so there was that part. But I think the deeper piece was that I didn't feel that this was my destiny to be a nun for the rest of my life. I felt it had been important, and I knew that I would never leave the Dharma, that the Dharma was the most important thing to me. But I felt like at that point, especially if I wanted to live in the West, which I did, it would become a path of repression and suppression of my sexuality, of my expression. I would be isolated, and I think for monks and nuns you really need each other. You need at least one other one who's committed to this, but to have a group is wonderful. It's support. Yes, I still feel the same. I was very happy, as I said, as a nun, but then I had my children, my 3 children, which was actually really difficult. And I have to say there were moments where I was crying and saying, what did I do? I had no idea, and I had no time to practice, and I had this feeling I'd made a big mistake sometimes. And at the same time, I realized that it hadn't really changed in the West in terms of monastics at that point. It's a little better now, I think, but still not very easy for them. And I realized that most practitioners in the West were not monastics. It wasn't something that was going to be supported very much in the West. And I loved my children, and I loved having them, and I really felt I learned a lot from having them that I wouldn't have learned as a nun. I remember seeing mothers when I was a nun and sort of thinking, well, what's the problem? Why don't they just, leave the baby and do this or do that? And I think it developed compassion and empathy for others. I went through so much as a mother, and I lost a child, and in relationships and so on, that I wouldn't have gone through had I continued as a monastic. And it put me in a place where I couldn't not know how many things feel that people experience. And I think if I hadn't gone through that, I would have less compassion and empathy for others, and And I think there's something to be learned as a mother, that the practice of the path of a mother is very powerful. It's, you know, we talk about compassion, we talk about selflessness and so on, but suddenly the baby's crying in the middle of the night, you're really tired, but you have to practice compassion and get up and be loving and present with that being. And so suddenly for me, all these things that had been theoretical were being tested. Are you really compassionate and patient and so on? So it was a real challenge, and I think being a mother is a real path, a genuine path that isn't appreciated. Well, that took me a long time to figure out also, because it is a real sort of split, where you see the feminine sacralized and elevated in the religious art and in texts and so on, and yet the actual condition of women on the ground, so to speak, is very different. And so what I think happened is that in early Buddhism in India, the feminine was really strong and women were very strong. You find a lot of the early Tibetan teachers who came to India studied with women. There were a lot of women teachers, and early Tantra from India had that motif of Yab-yum, the union of male and female as a primary image, and the Dakinis and Tara and so on. And Tantric Buddhism really comes from a matrifocal base from the early Indus Valley civilization as it developed, and then it went into Buddhism. And with it came these images of women and Dakinis and so on. And so when all that went to Tibet, it then went into Tibetan culture. And Tibetan culture was patriarchal. And the way that it was mainly established in Tibet was in monastic situations, whereas early Tantra was not oriented toward monasteries. It was yogis and yoginis wandering in the charnel ground. And so that's what happened, I think, is that these images and iconography came from India, from a different social situation, landed in Tibet, and then the feminine became idealized and theorized, while the patriarchal society continued on in the way it had. And then also the monastic establishments, as they had been in India, were established in Tibet, which monasticism has always been patriarchal. And as you know, those vows that the nuns have and so on. So I think it took me years to put this together, but I think that that's what happened, that there was the art and sort of the theory that came from India and came from a more egalitarian society. And then as that implanted itself in Tibet, those images were kept, but the social reality was very different.